Hello and welcome back to the Winning Agenda. My name is Jesse Muirman Marshall. I'm here with a strategy primer for Flesh and Blood about a topic that's very close to my heart. And here at the Winning Agenda, we actually, a very long time ago, did a podcast episode when we were doing our Android Netrunner podcast with the same title, Who's the Beatdown? And of course, this is a concept that is not something we've invented. It's something that was the subject of a very famous Magic the Gathering article very early on in Magic in 1999 by Mike Flores, who was an excellent Magic player. And the concept behind Who's the Beatdown, I've got an extract from the article actually in this video. The concept behind Who's the Beatdown is knowing your role. So in any game of Flesh and Blood, understanding your role, understanding your opponent's role, and what your path to victory is, and very importantly, what their path to victory is key to winning the game. I saw somebody post a question on the Flesh and Blood fan page today asking, has anyone created some introductory content about understanding sort of the path to winning and the path to understanding the game and the metagame a bit better? And I know that I've done videos about most of the heroes in FaB now, a bit of a primer about how they operate and what they are aiming to do and what you can do to play against them. But I think what's really important is starting with this fundamental concept which underlies all of those videos that I've done, all those hero primers, and that is, what is your hero's role and what is your opponent's role? And that's what I think is really important to becoming a better player. So this is the quote that I mentioned from the article, which I think really clearly sums up the point of this video and the point of the concept, which is misassignment of role. If you give yourself the wrong role in the game from the beginning and you don't understand what your role is, then you're going to lose the game. And the article which Mike Flores wrote, that's obviously related to Magic and these concepts in Magic, really clearly spells out how misunderstanding your role in the game is going to lead you almost inevitably to lose. Or at least it's going to injure your chances of winning very significantly. And I think this holds true to FaB, as we'll go through in a moment, when we think about the key concepts that underpin the game and the ways that top decks in the metagame try to get around them and use them, and the best ways to combat those top decks. Before we go any further, I've got an exciting announcement to make, and that is that Underground Games, which is an online store here in Australia run by the wonderful Rob CJ, located in Broken Hill, hence undergroundgamesbh.com.au, is offering 5% off to Winning Agenda viewers and listeners. So if you are looking to pick up FaB singles, either in Australia or elsewhere, Underground Games got very competitive prices and they're offering 5% off with the code TWA5. And it helps to support the channel, so if you can use the code, that'd be great. So the core to understanding your role is understanding your plan. And I think the metagame at the moment is dominated by three main decks, being Starvo, Prism, and Viserai. And Prism and Viserai have have very key plans in the game. And their plans, as we'll come to in a moment as we go through the video a bit more, revolve around trying to break the fundamentals of FaB and also challenge the way that other heroes are trying to play the game. So Viserai, rather than exchanging value 12 of cards in your hand, that's up to 3 resources, up to 3 block, and usually up to about 3 to 4 damage per card. Action points change that equation a little bit, but usually each of your cards is worth about 3, sometimes more or less on offense or defense trading off. Viserai says, over the course of the game, particularly if you're playing the OTK version, I'm going to bank a lot of my resources and my damage each turn in rune chance and then try and deal them to you all at once. I'm going to compress my damage into one turn to try and kill you and overwhelm your defenses in the hope that you only have the regular FaB amount of about 12 defense on that turn. Now, obviously, some heroes try to combat this by having more defense on that turn, whether it's by saving their equipment, which hopefully they don't have to use earlier in the game, or having other cards in their deck that will give them more defense, or using their arsenal on that key turn to have a defense reaction, for example. But in general, Viserai has a plan, and understanding and knowing that plan is key to coming up with those strategies to combat it. Similarly, Prism has a plan, which also breaks the fundamentals of FaB, because she, rather than having one weapon in play from the start of the game that's the same, Anathos, very powerful weapon for Guardians, as we'll come to in a moment, but stays the same throughout the game, doesn't get any better. Whereas Prism's Luminaris threatens that every aura that Prism adds to the board not only has its effect, but also is an additional weapon, and all her weapons will have go again. So as the game goes on, Prism's building up this board state, which not only is Spectral Shields, not only is other auras that have really powerful abilities, but they are also all weapons that can come at you if you don't control them. So understanding and knowing how to control Prism's auras and Prism's board state and what Prism is trying to do is really crucial to beating Prism, but also understanding the different ways that you can present those threats to an opponent in a way that's difficult for them to interact with is key to winning with Prism. Understanding your role, understanding what your opponent's trying to do, and I think Prism and Viserai are great examples of that. So all across this concept of knowing your role is knowing what the archetype and the plan of your deck is, as I've mentioned, and we have many different archetypes in FaB. So we've got the traditional sort of card game archetypes of Kano being a sort of combo hero, if you like, trying to assemble a range of different tools that when they're together, they're far more than the sum of their parts. You know, a Blazing Aether, even if you hit it off the top, if you haven't done anything else that turn, it does nothing. But a Blazing Aether after an Aether Wildfire into a Sonic Boom into something else, even a Scalding Rain, suddenly that Blazing Aether is massive. So Kano's got that really classic, each of the pieces are greater than, the sum of the parts is greater than each of the individual pieces, and it can throw a lot of damage at you if you don't control each of the pieces along the way, and if you don't bring the right tools to the fight in the form of Arcane Barrier. So understanding what Kano's trying to do, very important to combating it, but as the Kano player, understanding what you're trying to do and how best to string those combos together to get the sum of the parts to be as big as possible is the big challenge of being a Kano player. Oldhim, your classic control deck, is trying to maximize its block potential every turn to try and minimize the amount of damage it's leaking through, exhaust the opponent of key threats using one of the fundamental mechanics in FaB, which is that once you play your cards, they're gone, generally. Trying to exhaust the opponent of threats to the point where they don't have credible threats anymore, and Oldhim can start turning the tide, getting in with the weapon every turn, and then eventually coming in with some of the big attacks that have hopefully been pitched earlier in the game, either to Oldhim's natural defense reaction, which means Oldhim can block attacks without putting cards in the graveyard, simply pitching instead, which, as we'll come to later, is a really, really important way, both Oldham's defense reaction and defense reactions generally, of winning that fatigue battle, because you're exchanging resources for block, but rather than those resources going into your graveyard, like a blocking card does, they're going back into your deck for use later. So that's kind of an example of the way control decks are trying to get to that fatigue game state, trying to exhaust you, both of cards, but also of threats. Katsu, of course, is your archetypal aggro deck, or it can be. I mean, Katsu can play control, and I think before Oldhim came along, Katsu was one of the decks that could play a lot of really powerful defense reactions and play that control game. It obviously still can, but I think Oldhim probably does it better most of the time. But when we're talking about an aggro Katsu deck, what it is threatening to do is hit you with powerful on-hit effects and lots of go-again attacks. So again, like Kano, it's sort of like a combo aggro deck. It literally has the archetype combo in it, so the keyword ability combo. But if you aren't blocking Katsu's attacks, each of them on their own is not particularly strong. You can just die to the 1,000 cuts nature of it. But if you don't block the key attacks, you can also find that the subsequent attack, or even the one at the end of the chain, is significantly more powerful than if you had blocked. So playing Katsu into a metagame where there are a lot of heroes that are wanting to keep cards back in hand because either they're combo decks or they're aggro combo decks themselves. I mean, most aggro decks in FaB tend to be sort of aggro combo in nature because they don't just want to be throwing one or two cards at you a turn, rather. They want to be throwing their whole hand at you because they've got a lot of synergistic qualities between their cards, and Katsu is a great example of that. And funnily enough, aggro decks tend to be the best counter to other aggro decks in FaB because they tend to have on-hit abilities that demand the opponent block. And Katsu is another good example of that. Another example of that same issue is Lexi. As an aggro archetype, Lexi demands that you block, and rather than having on-hit effects like Katsu that buff your own attacks as the aggro deck, Lexi has the option to play these ice arrows that force you to pay resources or discard cards from your hand. So unlike Katsu that says, if you don't block me, I will potentially have massive turns that go on and on and on because I'm drawing cards, Lexi says, if you don't block me, you will effectively have had to block me anyway, or you'll effectively lose cards in your hand anyway, because you'll have to pay resources or discard cards from your hand, or get frostbites, which hamper your attacks next turn. So Lexi's, again, trying to combat other heroes' abilities to string together their combos on their turn. And the obvious counterplay there is to strip Lexi of her own cards in hand so that she can't assemble those chilling ice veins with fuses and things like that. But again, understanding Lexi's role, what role Lexi's trying to play in the game, what her most powerful turns are as the opponent, and trying to break those apart or combat them by blocking the arrows effectively. Then you've got another example of an aggro deck, Rhinar, which tries to take the choice away from the opponent. So it tries to say, I'm going to bet that over the course of the game, I can outdo you on damage output. You can have your cards on your turn to try and come back at me, but on my turn, when I'm attacking you, you don't even have the choice to block. I'm going to intimidate those cards out of your hand, and I'm going to hit you. So again, understanding Rhinar's plan, understanding that if you're coming up against Rhinar, either having things in your deck that you don't mind not having on your opponent's turn, and maximizing the things that you want to try and do on your turn is really, really important. Either having things on your turn that can gain you back life if that's important, or things that can amplify your damage output and try and force Rhinar to block, so the things again that Rhinar's coming back with are a bit less powerful. So Katsu, Lexi, and Rhinar all show you different variations of that FaB aggressive playstyle, and the importance against each of them of trying to strip cards from their hand, and the different ways that each of them will try to do that. Then you've got the control and the combo side of Kano and Oldhim, which are playing on their own sort of slightly different axis, but understanding those archetypes and what the hero is going to be trying to do to you. And when you're playing the hero, understanding when you're most powerful is very, very important. So understanding the key threats in the deck is really, really, really important to combating their game plan and knowing your role and knowing what role your opponent's trying to play. So things like Genesis, as I mentioned, these auras that Prism is going to try and play. Genesis is a powerful example early in the game of something that has a great effect for Prism. It generates other auras, it lets Prism cycle cards, and it's just a weapon in and of itself, just like the other auras, like I mentioned. So Genesis, is a key threat and a key part of that Prism game plan to overwhelm the opponent with weapons and auras. Sonata Arcanix, as I mentioned, that Viserai plan, the plan for Viserai is to combo off with Sonata, either as part of a one-turn kill combo or as a really high value turn that will take back tempo or finish off the opponent. Depending on what the opponent is trying to do, Viserai has the flexibility to play around Sonata and play around the rest of the cards in the deck to get the best value and give Viserai the best chance of getting the final damage through and killing the opponent. So that's why Viserai, I think, is a really good and powerful choice in the metagame at the moment, because this card and the rest of the deck are just really quite flexible between that mid-range plan, which is trying to attack you every turn, chip in for damage that's split between arcane and physical, and then hopefully hit you with a moderately sized Sonata at some point in the game. It can do that, or it against a heavy control deck that's going to be able to block out that mid-range plan, it can just sit back, generate rune chance, and then try and overwhelm them in one turn, just like we saw in the Australian Nationals with Hayden and Roy. Mask of Momentum is a great example of a key threat coming out of the Katsu deck. And you'll often see, whenever a Katsu aggro player sits down against another player, the other player, if they know what Mask of Momentum does and understands that that is one of the key threats in the Katsu deck, they can block the second Kodachi. They can try and break up those chains to make those chains of attacks hitting, so that the Katsu player never gets 3 chain links in a row that hit. And that's just, I think, the perfect example of understanding your role, understanding your opponent's threats, and combating them effectively. So there are some ways, I think, in FaB that you can lean into your role, or some key things to look out for that can determine your ability to play your role effectively. So things like value plays. These are 3 great examples of not these particular cards necessarily, but these types of cards in FaB that let you gain an advantage that goes beyond the immediate turn and the immediate turn cycle that you're in. So Turn Timber and all other defense reactions that cost resources to play, so Turn Timber, Unmovable, Staunch Response, all of those kind of larger defense reactions, Soul Shield, they let you convert a card in your hand into additional block on the defense reaction. And Turn Timber is a good example. So it costs 2, Unmovable is very similar, cost 2 or cost 3, so you're pitching one other card from your hand usually to play it, and then the Turn Timber effectively does 2 cards worth of blocking. But what that does in the long game and over the course of the game, if you have multiple of these sorts of cards in your deck, is if you're a fatigue deck or if you're just trying to gain that kind of long-term advantage, you're able to put the key card that you're pitching back into your deck. So you're only down 1 card, but you've done 2 cards worth of blocking. And that adds up over the course of a longer game to mean that when you get to the late game, you will actually have more cards in your deck than you otherwise would have, which is more swings with your hammer, it's more attacks with your weapon, or it's just more things that you can do that you otherwise wouldn't be able to if you were having to block. So defense reactions fulfill that role, as well as obviously the important role of combating dominate and those sorts of other game plans. It's important to remember that fatigue element, the anti-fatigue element that defense reactions can play. Sigil of Solace is a good example of something that can gain you a benefit that transcends the turn cycle. So even if your opponent's not attacking you, you can spend Sigil of Solace to gain 3 life. And I think it's a great example of something that's challenging for a lot of newer FaB players to understand. Because like, why would you, as a new player, why would you ever play Sigil of Solace if you could just play something that blocks for 3 instead and does some other stuff? That seems silly. But I think as you get more into the game and as you understand the way that it ebbs and flows a bit better, you understand that against a deck that's not going to be hitting you for 12, and particularly in a deck where you can come back with 1 or 2 cards and have a really effective turn, having Sigil in your deck allows you to potentially take a hit on an off turn, or obviously on turn 1 it's amazing when you get to redraw your cards anyway, but putting turn 1 aside, on an off turn when they're not presenting a huge threat, or perhaps you've got the tempo, you can use Sigil to gain a benefit that's going to last for the rest of the game and still have an effective turn. And it's important to consider these kinds of cards in terms of what are you giving up by having it in your deck on that turn when you draw it? Are you missing out on doing anything? So in a deck like Lexi that's trying to string together lots of different cards that play different roles, and some of them fuse and some of them are arrows, slotting something like Sigil in gets really challenging. But in a Bravo deck, for example, where all your cards are kind of interchangeable to an extent, and you're going to be pitching a lot of them as resources in the game, and then you've got a few reds. Really the cost for Sigil is it's taking up one of your red slots. But your turns and your powerful turns will usually be pitch a blue, make a seismic surge with your chess piece, and then pitch a blue, attack with Anathos. That's a serviceable turn as Bravo, attacking for 6. If you sometimes will be able to have 3 cards in hand because your opponent's had an off turn, so you block with 1 card, you've got 3 cards left in hand, then maybe it's good to Sigil and then pitch your 2 cards. Or if you've got 4 cards left in hand because you've had tempo, maybe you're happy to Sigil, pitch 2 cards to make a seismic surge and Anathos, and then arsenal your last card. And perhaps that's, if you didn't have the Sigil in your deck, that 4th card in that situation, since you've already got an arsenal, would kind of be wasted. So in some decks, there are some times when something like Sigil is going to let you convert a card in hand into a long-term advantage, and it becomes kind of a value play. Something like Oakenold is another example of something that goes beyond just your turn. It kind of is limited to the turn cycle in a way, but the tempo shift that it creates can last a long time. And the fact that if it hits, it's kind of similar to the Lexi arrows I was talking about before, and it's a great tool to combat all these aggro decks. And it's why I think this Bravo Star of the Show deck, the combination of this and Crippling Crush, why Bravo Star of the Show is rising to the top as sort of the premier aggro deck at the moment. Just because Oakenold and Crippling Crush and these discard on hit effects or discard on crush are so effective at combating opposing aggro decks in Flesh and Blood. So understanding that this is a value play, you're obviously getting the damage at a reasonable rate, plus you're getting this effect of dismantling your opponent's turn. That's an incredibly powerful play. And playing around this as the Bravo Star of the Show player or the Oldham player, very, very important, because this is one of the key threats in your deck, so using it effectively is really important. But obviously as the opponent as well, we've seen decks that are combating Bravo Star of the Show effectively, recognizing that and playing more unmovables, playing more cards that will allow them to survive these dominated Oaken turns without losing the cards in hand, to minimize the damage, minimize the impact, and combat the key threat that's coming at them. So one thing that is really important to understand as well, in all of these different archetypes and all these different roles within the game, is whether your deck is one that is trying to get the most out of your 12-point hands, or one that is trying to get around 12 points of value, get more than 12 points of value on some key turns. So something like Chain is a really good example that goes beyond these examples here, or it might use Time Snap Potion to do this actually, and it tries to get more than 12 points of value by using those cards in the Banish Zone on turns 5, 6, 7, and 8 to have massive turns that go well beyond, just what you can do with a 4-card hand or even a 5-card hand. And cards like Time Snap Potion, cards that get played from the Banish Zone, cards like Seeping Shadows, as well as the non-attack actions that let you play all of those things in one turn, allow Chain to have this sequence of a few turns later in the game or in the mid-game before it exhausts itself of cards completely that go well beyond your average sort of 12-point 4-card hand. Similarly, Prism Spectral Shields, as I mentioned, allow Prism with a 4-card hand to be pitching one to yellow to play a Herald, pitch another yellow to, say, make a Spectral Shield or do something else, and then use its entire board. And as you get to, as in all the auras on the board can then attack. So as you get to board states where there are 4, 5, 6, 7 auras on the board, all of a sudden the value that Prism is able to get from a 4-card hand is going well beyond that 12 points of value that you get from having 4 cards. Viserai, as I mentioned earlier, is trying to stack up these rune chants so that on one key turn, or on several key turns throughout the game, if it's playing more of a mid-range plan, it can be lobbing significant numbers of attacks and significant amounts of damage at the opponent that even if they block with their full hand, they're going to be leaking damage. And so that's, I think, one of the key things to understand is your deck trying to do that? Is your deck trying to do one of those things? Or is it just trying to present consistent threats throughout the game and stop what the opponent is trying to do? And if it's the latter, and if you're trying to stop what the opponent's trying to do, or even if you've got your own plan you're trying to execute, it's very important to be aware of what your opponent's plan is to break out of the shackles of this 12 points of value, of 15 points if you include the arsenal. Because if you can see it coming, and if you can understand what they're building towards, when they're going to be able to execute it, and what it takes for them to be able to execute it, then you can be ready and prepared with a defense reaction in arsenal, with a key, a counter card or something like that. So that brings us neatly to, some other cards that break 12 points of value that I wanted to mention as well. I forgot about this. So Channel Mount Heroic is a perfect example. So in the Briar decks that were playing Channel Mount Heroic, they were using the effect from Channel Mount Heroic the following turn and the turns after that. So they were saying, on my subsequent turns, I haven't had to pitch for Channel Mount Heroic to play because it stayed in play, but every single one of my attacks is getting +3, which is effectively another card's value on each of your attacks. So if you had 4 go again attacks on that turn, on the subsequent turn, that you after you played the Channel Mount Heroic and it stayed alive, then you're effectively getting 4 additional cards of value on that turn. And that's massive expansion compared to what you're usually able to execute in FaB with a 4-card hand. And that's why those decks were just so powerful with things like Ball Lightnings. Crown of Seeds is the opposite example, right? So it's trying to say, I will be able to get, with Oldhim, it is, but I guess with Bravo or Stavo, it's more of an offensive card. But as a defensive card in the Oldhim decks, what it's saying is, I'm going to get more than 12 points or 15, if we include the arsenal, of value out of this hand. So by spending 1 resource, I'm getting a block. I'm turning my arsenal into a new card in hand. So in effect, you may see, out of your 15 points, if you include the arsenal, I'm trading 1 resource, which is usually a third of a card in these Guardian decks, to turn my arsenal card into a card in hand. So you might say, actually, you're kind of down a little bit because you've traded a third of a card, or you're even really. You've traded a third of a card from your pitch for 1 point of block, which is kind of a third of a card's worth of block. But having a card in hand is just worth so much more than having a card in arsenal because it's so much more versatile. It can be pitched for resources. If it's a defense reaction, it can be used to block anyway. And if it's not a defense reaction, it can be used to block. So you're getting this kind of incremental, incidental advantage of just turning that arsenal card into a card in hand. And when you're playing a deck like Starvo, that is just obviously so valuable because cards in your arsenal can't be used to trigger your hero ability, whereas cards in your hand can. So you can see that kind of incremental value and that ability to get around the 12 points, 4 cards in hand restriction, and turn your arsenal into something even more valuable than it usually is. And lastly, I think Bravo Star of the Show is an excellent example where you don't have to actually spend any resources. Yes, you have deck building restrictions. Yes, you have to play some less powerful cards in your deck to trigger the ability. But the fact that you put no resources into it, but you get Go Again, Dominate, and +2 Strength is probably at least 1 card's extra value that you're getting on those turns when you trigger it. And that's something that can be very powerful if you're able to do it consistently, and if the value that you're getting off that ability is being put onto something else that's powerful, like a Crippling Crusher and Oakenold. And that's, I think, why those decks have been very strong. But if you're the opponent and you're able to say, as we said before, those Oakenolds, those Crippling Crush turns are the key way that Starvo deck is trying to get around this 12-point restriction in the game, and you can combat it effectively on those turns, then the ceiling of the deck, the power ceiling of the Starvo deck, is nowhere near as high as what Viserai can accomplish. It's nowhere near as high as what Prism can accomplish if left unchecked. And that's why those decks can serve as a bit of a foil, because if they can effectively combat Starvo's big turns, they've still got this excellent game plan, which is arguably more powerful once it comes off than what Starvo can accomplish. It's just that Starvo can do it quickly and earlier in the game. So the other element is kind of 2 more things I want to touch on. One is fatigue. I mentioned it earlier. These pitch to play defense reactions mean that your pitch card goes back in your deck and your unmovable or your whatever else is blocking for more than 1 card's worth of block. So that's really important. But in those fatigue game plans, if that's your plan or if you think that's your opponent's plan, you've got to think about what's the end game state they're trying to get to. And for Guardians, at least for Bravo, it's been, I want to be in this state where I'm attacking you with Anathos, which is costing me no cards from my deck. I don't have to discard any cards to attack with Anathos, but I'm coming in for 6. And there's not really a deck in the game that can absorb 6 damage a turn without spending any cards to block. So if Bravo can get to an endgame state with a reasonably even life total and be attacking with Anathos, it can chew through the last few cards in the opponent's deck and exhaust them because its attacks are not costing it any cards, whereas the opponents are more likely to. There aren't really many weapons that can consistently come in for more damage than what Anathos can. So the last thing I wanted to touch on is counterplay. So I mentioned earlier that once you know what your opponent's role is and what role they're trying to fulfill, and once you know what your role is and what's going to give you the best path to victory, understanding what key cards in FaB you can bring in from your sideboard to combat their plan is really, really important. And how to play into them, when to play them, and when your opponent is going to try and execute. So things like Runic Reclamation, really strong against Prism. It can destroy their auras for free. Like if you get a hit off on that, it's a massive threat to play it. And the Prism player knows that if you hit and they've got, one of their 4-cost auras in play, the threat of destroying that for free and making a rune chant is massive. So any Rune Blade wants to be playing Runic Reclamation against Prism. And understanding their plan and the power of this card at dismantling it is kind of key to understanding why that's so crucial in that matchup to play this card. Dissolution Sphere, again, if you look at the card, you might be like, that's a bit weird, doesn't really make a lot of sense. But when you think, well, this prevents all the damage from rune chants if Viserai tries to 1-turn kill me, it suddenly looks a lot more powerful. So it's one of the only cards in the game that can actually completely blank a Viserai's attempts to 1-turn kill. Like it just means no rune chants can hurt you for that turn. So that's an extremely powerful effect and definitely worth thinking about. If you're a Mechanologist player going to a tournament, at the moment, Viserai's a deck that's out there. Very important to have this card in your sideboard and bring it in. And likewise, if you're a Viserai deck and you're sitting down opposite a dash, thinking, should I play 1-turn kill or might I run into a Dissolution Sphere on a key turn that will mean I can't actually go off and I have to wait a few more turns. So very important card to be aware of and think about in terms of who is going to play what role in that game, and how the Viserai player is going to give themselves the best chance to win. Likewise, Spinal Crush. A powerful card against the right deck, but in some matchups for Guardian players, just not a very good attack to have in. If your opponent doesn't care about Go Again, it's probably not very good to play Spinal Crush. But against a deck like in the artwork, a Ninja deck or another deck that's wanting to throw multiple attacks at you in a turn, Spinal Crush can be absolutely game-ending. Very good against Prism, for example. Stops them getting their Go Again on their auras on a key turn. So understanding your role, understand your opponent's role, and which cards are going to help you fulfill your role in that matchup and combat the role they're trying to play is absolutely crucial to winning more games of Flesh and Blood. So that's all I had today. I hope you enjoyed the video. As I said earlier, if you want to head along to Underground Games, it's undergroundgamesbh.com.au. Use the code TWA5 to help support the channel. And otherwise, make sure you like and subscribe to support the content. And we'll see you next time. Cheers.